This is the Conversation of Things podcast from Smarter Home Life. I'm Joe DeGansick, a Phoenix-based home automation and lighting consultant and all-around tech guy. I'm having conversations about technology, the smart home, and all of those connected devices with interesting people both inside and sometimes outside the tech world. Released Friday, July 28th, 2017. My guest on this episode of The Conversation of Things is Dr. John Barentine. He's an astronomer and staffer at the International Dark Sky Association, fighting to save the night sky for future generations. And now, without further ado, let the conversation begin. So I want to welcome my good friend, longtime friend since college. It's Doctor, right? Can I just call you John?
Or should we just don't call me late for dinner?
Okay, officially, Dr. John Barentine from the International Dark Sky Association, the first guest on the interview couch. This is normally where I do the Q&A videos, but now I'm actually doing a real interview here.
I'm pleased to be the first.
The very first, and the second guest on the Conversation of Things podcast. Mm-hmm. So welcome, John. It's great to see you. It's been a while, actually, number one. But it's going to be great to talk to you, and I think we're going to have a lot of great topics.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So we've known each other since college, the University of Arizona, and even back then, obviously, you were studying, it was astrophysics, right? Mm-hmm. Back in the day. So tell us a little bit about your own background, and then kind of how you got involved with the international, with IDA.
Mm-hmm. I've been an astronomer all my life. I mean, this is basically from as far back as I can remember. That's kind of what I wanted to be or to do with my life. And I grew up here in Phoenix, which was then and still is a very light polluted place. And so trying to learn about the night sky firsthand when you're in a city is difficult, as people who live in cities know.
Completely. And we're right in the thick of it.
We're right in the middle of it. But I did that growing up, and then I went off and studied it in college. I did that professionally for a while. I was involved in activities in an observatory for several years. Ended up going back to school, getting my PhD, did some research for a while. And in the course of doing that, decided that I had too much of an interest in other things besides science and things like public policy and law and government, and trying to find something that really fit well within all of those categories.
Where you could probably make a difference, right?
It's nice to leave the office at the end of the day and feel like you have done something good for the world. And I found that in the form of a nonprofit called the International Dark Sky Association. So that brings in not only astronomy and the part of it that was sort of my first love, but then it's got all of these other things in the dynamic as well.
That's great. And it's been you've been with them a few years now,
Mm-hmm.
right? So so for most people who, because I think I had kind of heard of them on the periphery when I learned that you were working with them, and they're down in Tucson, right?
We are
headquartered in Tucson,
world headquartered. Right? But we are an international organization,
right.
So we have people throughout the world.
But down there in Tucson,
yeah.
U of A's territory, where we both went to college. Mm-hmm. So what is the mission of the of IDA?
Our mission is to preserve and protect the nighttime environment and our heritage of dark skies through responsible lighting. And that's a point that I really need to make, that the quest for dark skies is integrally involved in better lighting. It's not just turning the world's lights off, which sometimes people get that impression.
People probably think about that.
Right. No. But from our founding in 1988, we have worked with the lighting manufacturing industry to try to get that industry and the market it serves to produce better lighting and to get more consumer demand for better lighting, because we know that there are very good legitimate reasons that people have for using outdoor light at night.
Of course.
And we just want to get them to think differently about their relationship to that resource.
And I wanted to bring John on because, of course, as many of the longtime viewers of Smarter Home Life will know, the show on YouTube started as Lighting Answers, so it was lighting and home automation. Now it's kind of a broad mix of topics, but lighting is a big thing to me. And of course, most people don't think about it a lot, but it's important to all of us, especially once the sun goes down. So in terms of outdoor lighting and, like you were saying, preserving the night skies. So what are some of the things that I guess most people wouldn't know or wouldn't think about in terms of that good lighting for the outdoors and to help better preserve the night sky? How does that work? What are the steps that... Let's start with the general steps before we try to say like what consumers, I mean, because I'd love to bring some valuable information if possible.
Sure.
What steps people could do themselves in terms of outdoor lighting as well. But we'll talk about cities and municipalities too.
Sure.
But give us the general.
And there is a belief that it's something that starts with the individual. And we kind of take a page out of the old environmental playbook going back to the 1970s about thinking globally while acting locally.
Okay.
So it is quite true that every act undertaken by an individual on up to society level kind of things, it all makes a difference. So for the individual, that may be something as simple as shielding a porch light outside, or being mindful of the light that's escaping through your windows at night and making sure that you have adequate window coverings, that sort of thing. We have boiled it down to something that we often refer to as the 4 Ps, where the letter P stands for the word proper. So those are using light in the proper time, the proper amount, the proper location, and in what we call the proper spectrum, which we're going to get into a little bit more down the road in the conversation. But it's mainly, again, connecting up the use of light at night to tasks and making sure that the quantities and the qualities of the light are appropriate to whatever task you're trying to do. And we think that if people do that, they'll find that they need a lot less light to achieve the same goals.
That makes sense. People probably are usually in the mindset of having more than is needed. You know what I mean? Especially when they think of an outdoor lighting and night lighting and thinking, that we've got to have the largest possible output of our floodlights and big task lights and so forth. But even, like you mentioned, light that's escaping, because people wouldn't think about this, that indoor lighting is escaping your home through windows.
Windows, skylights.
I didn't think of skylights.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But that it's just escaping and causing problems. So I guess the flip side of that coin is, so for light that does escape, and having too much light in the outdoors, in the night sky, what is this, like, give me the top reasons, or what are the things that are most affected by this?
Probably the biggest impact that we know of right now is on the natural world in the sense of plants and animals, and I include humans in that too, because we have a biological system like all the other animals do that turns out to be remarkably sensitive to that, because we evolved in a world for billions of years where at night there were no other sources of light in our environment except natural sources. So the moon, the stars, fire,
right?
Lightning occasionally, a little bit of bioluminescence, but mostly the nights were very dark. So you got to figure, after this many billion year history of evolution under those conditions, it's only in about the last 130 years that we have been putting artificial light from electricity into the environment. And our biology is just not well equipped to handle that. And so the biggest impact, I would say, is to the biological world, which cannot adapt fast enough to make sense of this new input into its environment that has really never been there before.
And the rest of the living species that are around the globe don't have the technological advances or the thinking that we do to shield them. I mean, I'm sure they try to, shield themselves from light, but they're just not, like you said, they're just not equipped to handle that change.
They're not.
Right?
It's, as we say, that the animals can't retreat into their houses and just close the blinds, right? They have no way of blocking out. And conversely, it turns out that there are a lot of animal species, and I include things like insects, for example, that are drawn to light. They're almost fatally attracted to it, from insects buzzing around outdoor lights to birds along migratory flyways that are attracted to the lights of cities, and they'll either circle until they drop dead of exhaustion, or sometimes they collide with the lit building windows of buildings in downtown areas.
Because they're looking for the light.
So it can actually be deadly to them in a very direct way.
Have there been noticeable or noted, I'm sure there have been, in terms of any population declines of certain species, specifically due to this additional light in their habitats at night. Mostly, probably again with cities, really probably not in the outdoor or outlying communities so much, right?
Right. It's not conclusive, but we have suggestive evidence that it's a pressure on species. But there's even a balance in that, because the light will advantage certain species but disadvantage others. So you think about the spider that builds its web right under somebody's porch light.
Okay.
It's advantaged because now the food is coming to it.
Right. Yeah.
It's somewhat disadvantaging
Smart
to the
spiders,
insects.
right?
Yeah. Right.
They're not
It's
dumb.
disadvantaging to the birds, etc. But it may benefit certain species, but it's in ways that are not in their natural environment, and so now we're beginning to make changes to the food web. And that's where we worry that with the other environmental pressures that species face, a lot of which is related to climate change, that we may be setting them up to fail in the long run, but that we might not be able to pick out the light specifically as being the main contributing factor.
What are cities and municipalities and building owners and large stakeholders doing about this? And are they largely thinking about this? Obviously, I'm sure the IDA is working with them to kind of educate them on this. What are some of the steps that they are doing?
We have seen a slow drift in the thinking about this issue over the entire history of our organization. And I would actually credit us and our allies with the fact that in many cities now, you are likely to see shielded fixtures. So you are likely to see, the opaque shield around the porch light or something like that. And that's something that has really radically changed just in 20 or 25 years. So increasingly we see that the manufacturers are making products that tend to be fully shielded, or at least that's always an option. We still see lots of the decorative kind of fixtures that people think about, like carriage type fixtures with transparent side panels, or the globes, kind of the frosted globes. But we're seeing less of those because there's just less of market demand. As I mentioned earlier, we're getting people to think about the color content of the light, the spectrum. That's now moving into the market, and the market is beginning to respond to that as well. And as we have found out that there are problems with human exposure to blue light, we're gradually seeing more market demand for so-called warmer white fixtures that are emitting less of this blue.
Right.
So cities are putting them into practice by switching out their street lights. Consumers are doing it on the local level with exterior lighting on homes. Businesses can do it. And they're also finding that they're saving money in the process. So we hope that it ends up being a win-win all the way around. But first, people need to become aware of the issue. And that's largely what my organization does.
Right. And largely we're talking about, again, saving money with like LED lighting. I've reviewed many of those products over the years, and one recently, this was the drift light, not exactly a smart light bulb, but one that outputs less. It's odd that it's blue, but it actually outputs less blue light, and it has a kind of an auto dimming feature that'll dim over to kind of simulate sunset. It's supposed to help you sleep better. Not really 100% sure of that, but again, less. And when we're talking about blue light, we see a lot of blue light during the day because of the sun, and when you're at the middle of the day, we're in the middle of the afternoon when we're recording this right now, but it's really blue light at night, which obviously affects us and our circadian rhythms, and like we're talking about with the animals. What is it about this extra blue light at night that really is just messing with humans and animals, and even plants, I guess?
And plants. And you identified that when you talked about sunlight. And people, they think of the sun as yellow. Like, when kids draw pictures of the sun, they use yellow crayons. But when you go out and you actually look at the color characteristics of sunlight, it's remarkably blue, as it turns out.
And we're talking about color temperature, if you guys haven't, when we talk about spectrum, that's the term which I use all the time on the show. That blue is cooler and warm is more yellow.
Correct. And so even your white light can have a little bit of a hue. And so most of what the sun outputs is white light, but it has a little bit of a blue bias just because of how the sun is generating that energy. And then that's augmented by the blue of the blue sky. So if you're standing in the shadow of a building, you're really just seeing the blue of the sky. But if you're out in the sunlight and you add the sunlight to that, you still end up with something that's biased towards the blue. So because we evolved in that environment where we were exposed to that for a certain number of hours a day, and then effectively darkness on the other side, our biology expects blue light at certain times. And as it turns out, it syncs up with a clock that's in our brains that interacts with our DNA. And there are switches being flipped on and off at different times of the day to produce or destroy certain proteins. And those proteins regulate metabolic activities in the body. So what the research is now telling us increasingly is that if you put blue light into this biological system at a time when the body does not expect it to be there, because again, the brain is keeping time basically on a 24-hour basis, then you start up the mechanism producing certain hormones at times of day when the rest of the body does not expect that to happen. And what we have seen is a demonstrated link between that disruption, as we call it, circadian disruption mediated through blue light, that is affecting the incidence of certain kinds of chronic human diseases such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, and also certain forms of cancers.
Wow.
That we know are linked to these hormonal changes that are induced by the circadian system.
That's even news to me because I thought it was mostly just like sleep disorders. I'm sure that's part of it too.
Yes.
Right?
And that was where the first indication came from, was by studying shift workers. So people who were already, they were forcing themselves to be awake out of sync with the day-night cycle, but now we're seeing indications of it in broader populations beyond just people who do shift work. So there's obviously an indoor component to that, right?
Okay.
But we're also worried about the outdoor component, because even if, let's say, you have pretty good curtains, but you have a really bright street light out in front of your house that's blasting in light and a little bit is making it around. We don't know the answer to this question, but the question is, does a low but sustained level of light exposure through the night phase of the sleep cycle create the same kind of disruption that a bright source does?
And more specifically, again, if it's on that blue
into the spectrum, right? So there's interaction with, of course, what the cities are doing and upgrading their street lights, and that led the American Medical Association about a year ago to issue a report specifically identifying outdoor lighting, specifically street lighting, at high color temperature with a lot of blue emission, with the potential for these unintended consequences of large incidence of disease in the population.
Wow.
But I always caution people, we have to be very careful about interpreting the studies, because it's still a preliminary conclusion. But increasingly, as we see more research being done, that the needle of the compass is generally pointing in the same direction on this.
But and I think, it does sound fairly, even if you don't even look at the studies, but with the information about, or the consensus among many people, and the fact that our history is, yes, the sun has gone down normally. You you have an absence of light except for fire and some natural sources. And then again, 130, 140 years ago, you introduce all this artificial lighting. You're going to screw something up, even on some small level. So I think that that even,
and we're still learning about what those things are.
Right.
And there's new investigations of, does it affect this species or that? And what I can confidently say is that basically all the papers that I'm seeing now, when they go and they study some model organism, whether it's an animal or an insect or a plant species, you just don't see cases where they find no effect at all.
Sure, that's what I mean. There's always going to be something, and as the studies come out, we're going to learn more the exact details of really how this affects us, the whole planet.
The solution to this problem, in many respects, is very simple. And I do think that we could solve this problem in about a generation. And it would proceed along the lines of how, to use another example, how smoking used to be really a public health crisis in this country.
Right.
And in the span of a generation, we decided as a society that there was a problem, that there was a solution, and we demanded that the solution was forthcoming.
Right.
And we implemented it. And so it's the same thing. If we can achieve that kind of critical mass on the issue of light pollution, I think we could solve it quickly.
And a lot of people are in the process now of upgrading, whether it's residential, commercial, whatnot, cities, to LED lighting anyways, which provides certain benefits that most people would want, like economic benefits, that if the removal of some light pollution and blue light comes along for the ride, that's a win-win.
Absolutely.
Right?
And the LED conversion that the world is experiencing right now as we all move to solid state lighting
Yep.
is one of those things that's we're kind of on the edge of both a great amount of promise, but there's also a tremendous challenge associated with that because we're making light cheaper to produce, just fundamentally because of the increased efficiency.
Mean you could produce more of it.
Yeah, and there's a tendency in the West, there are rebound effects when you have advances in technology like this, where when something becomes less expensive to produce, we tend to use more of it and not less. And so part of our challenge in front of us is convincing people why they should take the savings from the energy efficiency and roll it into other things besides putting out more light.
More actual, like, physical. Just because they're cheaper to run, don't go and buy out more lamps and just stick them in your yard, because that could be the tendency. Just as I've talked about on the show before, use it, thoughtfully. Use all of this technology, thoughtfully.
Yes, and that amplifies what I said earlier about, we're not here to turn the world's lights out. Because we know that's not a good way to address this issue. But again, we're trying to change this relationship that human beings have to their use of light at night. LED, when it is properly designed and implemented, could be of a tremendous benefit to the struggle against light pollution because it's a highly directional source. So instead of something that's very diffuse and kind of goes in all directions, right? LEDs can be very highly directional, and so therefore we have a great degree of control over where we put that light. And by controlling better where we put the light and its duration and its intensity, and even we can do phasing things with different colors of LED, like your light bulb that you showed.
Right.
That could give us a lot of the control that puts the light where we need it and when and in all the right characteristics. And then the light is otherwise not there. Let's
talk about it a little bit more, kind of on the, because I know when we were kind of building our notes for the show, we're talking about how this links, because you, the podcast viewer, probably thinking, well, what does this have to do with home automation or the IoT? Well, a lot, actually. What we've seen over the past years, really the rapid new development of all the home automation tech with smart lighting or dimmers or whatnot, and everything being connected. The same could apply to streetlights. Now, we were chatting before the show because I was asking you, because Phoenix is working on, where I live, is working on a deployment. Many cities around the world are. Your city, Tucson, just finished one, or is almost done with one, right? Of deploying LED. But isn't there more that can be done than just, and you may live in a city that is deploying LEDs and replacing all their existing, those kind of peachy looking sodium vapor lamps, right? But there's a lot of other things that can be done with that technology beyond just replacing it, right? And getting the benefit of, all right, it's cheaper, it lasts longer, right?
Yes. One of the main benefits that LED offers that the old systems, like you mentioned, the sodium lighting, which most people are familiar with and has been a standard for about 35 years, is that LEDs are dimmable. They don't have sort of this minimum threshold like a sodium lamp does, that you have to give it a certain amount of juice and then the light comes on and then it only gets brighter from then on. And you can't really control its output very well. But with LEDs, we have exquisite control not only of spatially where that light falls because of the directional nature of the light, but also the intensity. And you can change that intensity through the night without putting a lot of strain on the controls. So that you could imagine a system where in a city after midnight, the lamps dim down to maybe 50% of what they were earlier in the night when you expect less traffic. Right. And then an hour before sunrise, they ramp back up to full power. And you can do that without shortening the lifetime of the controlling electronics. So that's a very practical thing that LEDs enable now that we really could not do with earlier lighting systems.
Yeah. Would people perceive that, though, in terms of if lights were dimming in their neighborhood after a certain hour, would they potentially perceive that as less safe because it's less bright? Or are there ways of mitigating that fear?
Oh, you said the S word, safe or safety, which is one of the main sort of points on which the public tends to push back against any kind of a plan to dim or reduce the amount of lighting under a perception that they won't be as safe, which I can tell you that the research shows that adding light to spaces that were not previously lit, or even adding more light to places that were dimly lit, apparently doesn't have any measurable impact on crime or the incidence of crime. Not that we can detect in the data. As far as general public safety, we will always come down on the side of safety. So if there's a public safety issue about being able to, to move about safely at night, we're always on the side of safety, and we will say light in that case. With crime and the sense of security, it's a lot less clear. And I think that's more motivated by human psychology than it is by any kind of actual connection between the amount of light we use and the incidence of crime. If you were out on the street at night at the time that your city dimmed its lights and you watched a light dim, you might worry about that. You might think, wow, it just got dimmer. Something's going to happen, probably something nefarious.
Someone immediately will jump out of the shadows.
Yeah,
right?
They're just waiting for that. Although, as it turns out, there's a little bit of data that suggests that adding light actually increases the likelihood of perpetration of violent crime because it makes victims easier to find in the darkness. If you can believe that, but that's what the data are telling us.
Okay.
So instead, if you were to ramp down the intensity of light over a period of tens of minutes, the dimming would be almost imperceptible.
Okay.
Right. As it turns out, also, and we've just learned this in Tucson, that you can dim the lights, and if the conditions are just right, people don't even know that you've done it. So
is that compared to the previous system of lighting?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. So for our new LED conversion that we've just gone through, we went from 400 watt high pressure sodium lights that put about 60 lux of light at the roadway surface to I think they're 18 watt 3000 Kelvin white LEDs, and I've gone out and measured this at the street level, and those lamps are putting out about 17 lux, so a factor of 4 less. But when you're out there viewing it in place at night, because we've shifted the eye, and we've shifted the spectrum of the light from more warmer colors with the sodium to a little bit cooler color with the white LED, and now we're putting more light into the part of the spectrum that the human eye is more sensitive to at low light levels, the scene brightness looks the same. Wow. So this is why, despite the fact that they've dropped the amount of light that they're putting at the roadway by a factor of 4 times, there's been almost no resident complaint.
And they're using far less power. I mean, the fixture itself is probably not running at full power either.
Correct.
Right?
They started out dimming all of the new lights to 90% of their full output.
Okay.
Because like any form of lighting, over time, the output is going to naturally decrease with age.
Sure.
So now, by dimming a little bit right at the start, they can turn the knob up as the light depreciates, and they can maintain a constant light level over time.
Over the time period.
Right. So overall, they reduced the number of lumens of light that our street lighting system emits by 62%.
Wow.
And it's going to save the city something like $2 or $3 million over the next decade.
That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
It's fantastic. But what about with smart cities? We hear about this all the time.
Yes.
with sensors and streetlights acting as Wi-Fi poles and just so many different things. But what about is it possible to have streetlights that can dynamically change to the conditions? You mentioned timing, but what about if it's just in an area that no one's in? It's just a part of town that or a highway that just needs a minimum illumination, or maybe it needs extra illumination if it detects motion.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any movement on this beyond just the predictions of the future in science publications?
There's been a little. The epicenter of that tends to be in Europe, where EU regulations are calling for more carbon emission, and so they're reducing electricity consumption.
Wait, more or less?
Excuse me, less. Sorry. Greater cuts in carbon emission. No. They're not calling for more
carbon emission. Yes, that's what we want.
The EU member countries are under pressure to reduce their carbon emission, and they're doing that as much as possible by reducing electricity consumption. So not only are they converting over to LED, but they're finding ways to further reduce the amount of light that they're using in order to hit those goals. And so they are doing demonstrations of things. And they're in some villages, for example, in the Netherlands, this is already happening, where you'll have a networked string of streetlights in a village, and they have proximity sensors. So they'll start out at a dimmed level overnight. They may only be 10 or 20% of their full output. And then as a car approaches, the first light in the string will come up to 100%. And as the car passes, the next pole already knows that it's coming and begins to ramp up as the one behind it ramps down, and can do this all the way down the string. So you're literally only using the additional light, because there is evidence that you need a certain amount of light in order to assure traffic safety.
Of course.
And so we don't want to cut this out completely.
No.
But when there are no cars around, for humans to walk on sidewalks or for bicyclists to see curbs and things, turns out you need a lot less light. So you have that light being at the appropriate level when those activities are taking place. But then when you have a motorist who's traveling faster and needs more light, then the light will ramp up.
Come on.
And that can be used in combination with things like reflective pavement or self-luminous surfaces to further reduce the need for electric lighting. Also think about, this is not so much of a problem for us around here, but in other parts of the world where your streets are covered by snow for some fraction of the year.
I was going to ask you about some of the other solutions we've seen by companies like solar roadways.
Solar roadways, yes. As an alternative to lighting. So instead the road surface becomes luminous, but it can also, through resistive heating, it can slightly raise the temperature of the roadbed above the freezing point to ensure
to keep it that it's the snow will never really form or
you won't get ice on surfaces at night. But even if you don't go to that extreme, just having streetlights, for example, that have a downward-facing sensor and are looking for enhancements of the reflection off the ground that you would get with snow, and then adjusting the light level down because you want a constant level of illumination on the road surface. A bright light on a snow-packed street, for those of you that have ever driven on a street like that, it can be dazzling.
Pretty blinding, right?
It can be blinding to the point that it's then hard to see moving objects, and then that becomes a public safety issue unto itself. So there are some manufacturers that are looking at ways of doing this sort of feedback with the environment to find out, well, what is the optimum amount of light for a particular set of circumstances?
No, that makes sense. If we pivot back a little bit towards, because I think we've covered quite a bit with the cities, and I think we're going to see some of these things into the future as they make sense. I can't imagine that it's going to roll out. These sensors and smart lighting for cities may roll out universally everywhere, but I mean, as it makes sense, because cities are different sizes and different locales and different geographic regions. It just makes sense to have different configurations as it makes sense. I guess actually one last question before we kind of pivot over to kind of like the home side of things is with light pollution and with the IDA. We've talked about dark skies. I think some people initially think about dark skies with stargazing, right? Which of course that's part of your wheelhouse with astronomy. And we see sometimes, I think Tucson's, I don't know if they still are using this. They used to have, around the observatories, you would see different forms of street lighting that would seem to be very, very, very warm.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how, is it only the color of light that can assist us with kind of creating these darker areas of cities, so that if people wanted to use their telescopes or learn more about the night sky, that they don't have to go out 50, 80 miles and travel to, for around here, we would be like going up to Sedona or Prescott to get a really beautiful night sky because there's simply less light pollution up there.
Right. We do have a concern about the white LEDs in particular, and even the really good ones they still have some amount of blue light that they're emitting. And as it turns out, for the same physical reason that the sky is blue during the daytime, that blue light scatters really efficiently through the atmosphere. So if you think of your standard sort of street light that's emitting light at all angles, but let's say that it's not emitting any up directly, but that you have certain rays of light that come out at very shallow downward angles. If that's a blue ray of light, it stands a good chance of scattering up into the sky before it reaches a target.
Okay.
So we're starting to think about what are the alternatives to white LED. What can we do besides that color? And the two leading contenders for that are amber LED, which you were talking about, the very warm looking to the point that they're almost orange.
Or yellowish.
Yellowish.
Yeah.
So that reproduces that older technology. So confining the light to a very narrow part of the spectrum, but you lose some things like color rendition, and it's not going to be
some
for every
visibility
community.
and
The other option, and there's a company right here in Phoenix that's pioneering this, is You take a normal array of white LEDs, as you would in a typical fixture, and you put a slab of filter material.
It's a lamp, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's environmentally durable, so
Sure.
it's not going to fall apart
Yeah.
under sun exposure.
Right.
And you just cut out the blue altogether, and you let the other colors through. So you
Okay.
get something that's kind of a yellow color that comes out the other side. And both of those approaches, again, limiting the blue light, will also limit this thing that we call sky glow, and that's what's making it hard to see the stars.
So kind of pivoting back to the other core concept of smarter home life is, the home. We talked about, light getting out of your windows, but I know part of what we were talking about with the planning for the show was you even mentioned indoor light pollution.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that beyond just blue light? Is it also kind of actually, again, creating that quality light for your own home, inside, even if we take out the factor of it getting outside?
Yes. And that requires that we not only think about area lighting, but we also think about our devices that we're staring at. And this is an important point, because a lot of these devices are emitting a tremendous amount of blue light because they're calibrated under the assumption that they're being used mostly during the day. And so
Right.
that goes for tablets and phones, but it also goes for television sets and things of that nature. So that's kind of one level of consumer electronics that we have to worry about. But if you're thinking about your area lighting or your task lighting, of course the blue is important, but also keeping in mind that even relatively blue weak light, as it were, so light that has warmer colors in it, if you're still getting that exposure after dark, you are still messing with the biological machinery that's trying to tell you when it's time to go to sleep. And so you should do everything, of course, to limit your blue light exposure after dark outside, but also think about the intensity of the light that's in your home space, because even if it's warm white light or if it's another color, you're still putting light into your body at a time that it doesn't expect it to be there.
And that's like we've talked about quite a bit on the first part of the show. It's very important to limit that. And now in the modern world, you can do these things with automation, and you can slowly ramp down lighting, or you can simply, at certain times of the night, that if you don't need extra lighting on, turn it off. I mean,
Absolutely, and also controlling the color. So you could imagine a home automation system that around dusk had still mostly sort of daylight color and intensity in the home, and then progressively through the evening, so slowly that you might not even know that it's happening, it's ramping down both the intensity and shifting the spectrum toward warmer colors, so that by the time you go to bed, the ambient light in your space is more like, think of the intensity of firelight.
Right.
That would be much more conducive to sleep and preserving circadian rhythm. What we have to think about is task lighting. So if you're doing things in the home that require better color rendition, which you would need more bluer colors for, that comes down to thinking about when you're timing those activities. Can you move those towards the earlier part of the evening, so
Right.
You're not hunched over your craft table with bright blue light right before you go to bed at night?
Right.
That kind of thing. And that's automation can only do so much. We
Right.
still
We
need
still-
judgment involved.
That's
in this
right,
as well.
because you still have to live life, right?
Yeah, that's right. And we know, there's all kinds of things that we do in the evening that we're certainly not advocating going back to a world
Caveman's.
where... No.
Right,
We're far
right.
beyond that. But we do envision a circumstance where automation and intelligent design and control can more or less reproduce the kind of conditions that we think are basically optimal.
Right.
For people's exposure to light at night, and so that these problems that we associated with it gradually start to go away.
And I think that, like we talked about indoor, but again, jumping back to the outdoor side, again, it's easy to overdo things. And I was talking with, I started these months ago, but now they've been ramping up these consulting sessions with many of the Smarter Home Life viewers, doing these one-on-one video-based sessions. And I was talking with one viewer recently who's putting together a new home, and was talking about a lot of outdoor lighting as well. And I think, as you were saying, people can kind of go bonkers sometimes if outdoor lighting, it's LED, it's not going to cost me anything beyond the initial bulbs to just put it in. And maybe, again, if you do want, because people like to light up their homes, they like to show off what they're going to do. But again, a lot of this can be controlled through not just thoughtful planning, but also through thoughtful automation. And so, John, what would be, because some people might say, well, if the lights are cheaper, I'll just put more of them in, or if I'm building a really unique, beautiful home, and I want to highlight so much of it outside. I mean, maybe make it the envy of the neighborhood, right? But how do they do that while continuing to preserve the environment and still beautify their home?
Mm-hmm. And I'd be the first to say, once again, that I'm not going to tell you to turn off all your lights. I think that there are better ways of doing it than others. I think there are ways of doing the lighting design that specifically highlights aspects of the architecture. So instead of uniformly illuminating all the sides of your house with uplighting, which just presents a very uniform, bright thing up on the hill, basically, fewer lights that are strategically placed is a good way of doing that. Show off the unique elements of the architecture or of the landscaping. Ideally, you would avoid direct uplight. A lot of people like to put
just throwing
light
right
up into a tree or something like that.
Yeah.
That I've seen some very nice designs where they put very small but downward directed lights in a tree, and the result is really magical. I think it looks a lot. Personally, it's a lot more aesthetically pleasing. Yeah, right. If you're dealing with lights that are already in place and you're thinking, oh, I'll convert them over to LED, I'll save a little bit of money. Again, think about the intensity of those lights. Also,
the color.
And the color,
okay.
Which, it's outdoors, so I'm not as concerned about people spending a lot of their time and being exposed to that. But again, you're doing this for the benefit of wildlife, and there is such a thing as urban wildlife too. So just because you live in a city doesn't mean that you're not affecting a population of different species. But the uplight is the thing that worries me the most, because of course it goes directly up into the night sky. And there are just better ways to do it now. But if you're thinking about switching out things, think very carefully about the decisions you make. And I did also want to mention this concept that we frequently talk about called light trespass.
Oh,
so when you shine light on your house, you might incidentally sort of miss the corner of the house, and the light is now falling on your neighbor's wall and maybe in your neighbor's window.
Okay.
And that's
we've heard of that before, as people have lights or just crazy things even inside their homes, and it's being this like when you're living in like apartment complexes or very, very close quarters, that you're blinding other people, right?
Yes, and even in residential neighborhoods where there's single family homes, or you wouldn't believe the number of phone calls that we get to my office that start out along the lines of, my neighbor has a porch light, and etc.
Wow. Okay.
So again, in your design, even if it's a retrofit, be mindful of your neighbors. Try to be a good neighbor as much as possible. Try to contain your light to your property. That's a good rule of thumb, because, again, I think you'll find you need less of it. It's better directed. It better highlights the things that you want people to notice about your home.
And through automation, you can, even though people don't always think about this for outdoor lighting, and the previous iterations of landscape lighting, what we think of as, you go to Home Depot and you buy the 12-pack and you stick them in the ground, a lot of that has not been dimmable or automatable.
Correct.
In the past. And we're starting to see those more in the realm of being controllable, some of which you may have to just shut down, which will save you power, but some of them could be dimmed over time, where just like you were saying in the cities, once you get to a certain hour, just kind of like with, I'm sure we could add another 20 minutes to the show and talk about holiday lights. We're nowhere near although we're nowhere near the holidays here in this part of the world, but on the other side of the world it's cold instead of being warm. But I'm sure with, again, holiday lights, people light these places up like crazy. But again, think about your extra landscape lighting and whatever that you could shut down after a certain hour. Does that make sense?
I tell people that all the time.
Okay.
Like, who is out at 3 a.m. noticing your nice architecture, except people who probably have some bad intent in mind.
Right.
I mean,
and one quick question I had for you in terms of we'll pivot right just quickly back to street lighting. Mm-hmm. You were saying that, of course, with LED it's directional, and with the newer street lights that you see, they kind of put different. I know the older style of the sodium vapor lights were a lot of times called like cobra heads or things like that. But the newer ones are very directional. Does that help with? I know some people complain a lot that my street light is always in my window and I have to put up these blackout curtains. Do the new streetlights help with cities being able to direct that light really to the street and not blasting it into homes?
It could.
Tough question.
It could.
Okay.
By and large, it is not.
Okay.
And the very closely related effect to that is the phenomenon of glare. So, as one lighting engineer told me, if you're standing directly under a streetlight and you look up at it, you kind of get what you deserve. But it's more this idea that the designers are trying to throw the light to very large distances. They're trying to get as much area coverage on the ground with one light as possible.
Okay.
But as a result, that means there's a lot of light coming out at shallow angles. And from a distance, some people may notice that the new LED streetlights are almost blindingly bright. And that's because now your eyes are directly receiving rays of light that really should be striking the ground. And so one of the shortcomings of a lot of the design right now is that it produces too much glare. There are some innovations that are coming in the sort of next generation of LED streetlights that I think are going to help with that. But for now, that's a problem that a lot of people notice.
As we kind of slowly get to wrapping up the show, what's next in lighting in general? We went from the old pressure type systems for this is for really commercial lighting and street lighting, but for homes we've gone from incandescent, we've gone to fluorescent and CFL. Some homes still use fluorescent, regular tubes and whatnot. Now we're at LED. There's been the talk of OLED, which we know from many devices, not the iPhone, although there's the rumors for the next one. Mm-hmm. But Android phones use OLED. Many of our like in-car dash audio systems use OLED displays. Is that coming to lighting? Is there anything beyond OLED? Mm-hmm. In terms of for general illumination, like what's mm-hmm. coming next?
So OLED, for if people have never heard of it, is the O stands for organic. So it's an organic LED, and it refers to the exact material that it's made out of. But the idea there is instead of LEDs have little, very discrete points of surface that they emit light from. They're very tiny, and that's part of what leads to that glare problem, is the fact that you're emitting so much light from a very small surface area.
Okay.
OLEDs can be manufactured in different sizes and are more or less uniformly emitting. So you could imagine, in a very extreme case, is that you could make the entirety of a wall out of OLED material and the whole thing would be faintly glowing. But rather than something that large, think about a desk lamp, for example.
Okay.
So now the sort of the globe part of the lamp is an OLED material, and it's got a uniform illumination, and it's anywhere from 10 to 100 more times energy efficient than even an LED is.
Wow, so I didn't know that about the energy efficiency.
That's the next big step up, is as we move into the OLED era, which I think is coming, that we will gain even more energy efficiency, and therefore some of the problems that we've talked about in terms of the tendency to overuse the resource, that may be further exaggerated as a result of that pickup in energy efficiency. But there are other technologies. They're pioneering in places like China, technology called plasma, which uses radio waves inside a little resonant cavity to emit light. Right now is not very energy efficient.
But might be
similar
at all to what people would think of as plasma TVs, or not?
That's a different technology altogether.
Okay.
Actually, this technology is a lot closer to your microwave oven.
Okay.
Except that it emits visible waves of light rather than radio frequency waves.
Okay.
But it's in its infancy, and it's unclear whether it will be dominant. Another possible avenue for this is related closely to LCD projectors. So think of it like how we look at PowerPoints and things like that now, which shine light off of arrays of very tiny micron-sized mirrors, and those mirrors are individually addressable, and you can move them around, and so you can direct where that's light.
Those are in some projectors now, right?
They're in DLP as
DLP.
Another version of that, but they involve these micromirror arrays.
Okay.
So another possibility is that we shine intense beams of light, like laser light, off of micromirrors that are coated with a material that we generically call a phosphor. So it's the same idea as in like a CFL lamp, right, where you're really generating ultraviolet light, but then you're turning it into visible light by shining it off this phosphor material. And so that will give us even further control over where the light goes. We can rapidly reconfigure that light to illuminate anything we want. We'll have perfect control over the spectrum, the timing, the intensity. That I think is probably maybe 25 years away.
Okay.
But we're headed in that direction.
So check with Lowe's in about 25 years.
Wait 25 years.
Wait a little while. It is exciting, and what I found interesting about the LED world, you started to see some of the bulbs come out about 5-6 years ago, but they were generally awful. And then companies like Cree and Philips really they got the price point down, they got the quality up, and people said, "Oh, it's a thing, we could buy it," and here it is.
Right.
And that's kind of what it takes. I've seen only 1 or 2 fixtures, and not even in person, that are OLED fixtures. But I think that that has the ability to just make lighting really interesting, because, like you said, it can be
any surface,
any shape,
any surface. And this is an interesting fact that I've learned from people that I've interacted with in the lighting industry. There's so much market pressure concurrent with the rapid development of the technology that right now the life cycle of an LED product is about 18 months.
Wow.
It is that short. And so if that's any indication as to how rapidly it will proceed in the future, right. I think the time where we see OLED in indoor environments is maybe 5 years away. Okay. Maybe sooner than that.
Okay. Fascinating, because of course LED is sold as going to last you 20 years.
Maybe.
We
don't know yet.
A lot of testing involved,
yes.
But we'll see what the actual lifetime is and what comes next. All right, so we're gonna wrap this up with what is this is only the second episode, but it's going to be a tradition as time goes forward. I'm calling them the 5 rapid fire questions, and this is kind of about home automation and apps and technology and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. There's no yes or no or right answers or anything like that. So
don't overthink it.
Don't overthink it. What's one gadget that you don't have but you just must have? And this could be anything, home automation related or just any kind of tech gadget.
I want like the master control thing. I want the thing in my pocket that I don't even have to think twice about, whether it's voice or whatever it is. And every automatable aspect of the house is there. And we're almost there, but not quite. That's what I want.
Okay. Let's see. How often, this is the opposite of tech. How often do you unplug and go without like devices or tech for an entire day?
Not as often as I should.
Okay. Let's see. What's one thing that you'd love to automate or make smart in your home right now, but seems like it's impossible?
Well, short of having personal assistant robots, and because we were supposed to have had flying cars 50 years ago.
Of course.
I want the device that will. I want the device that will not only wash my clothes but also fold them and put them away.
We saw something like that at CES. It didn't wash them, but it folded them. It didn't quite put them away, but
we're getting there. We're getting there. We're going to have.
I want the washer there, that has a conveyor belt and it puts it in the dryer and then puts it into that other thing. And
I think that's what we'll get first. I still have this fantasy that we'll have Rosie the robot from the Jetsons, but if we can get just devices that talk to each other and hand off the task from one to the next.
Exactly. That didn't need a reboot every other time. What's one thing in your life that you wouldn't want to be smart or to be automated?
You know what? Strangely enough, it's books. I don't have an e-reader. I don't really see the attraction to e-readers, although I guess I know why people use them, but there is just something about a paper book.
Analog paper.
Yes, and even digital ink will not reproduce.
Right.
Yeah.
One app that you can't live without.
Strangely enough, there's an app called Sleep Cycle that's been out for 3 or 4 years and monitors your sleep quality either using the position sensors in your device or it can use audio cues.
Do you have to you load it up? I had one a couple of years ago. Do you have to sleep with your iPhone or?
They've gone from it had to be on your mattress in order to sense the position changes, but now they use the mic and listen to your breathing and things like that, which I know some people think might be a little creepy. But then it can be on your bedside. But the quantity of data that it has yielded has given me real insights about the things that contribute positively or negatively to my sleep. And that is one thing that I think has actually made a difference in my quality of life, to tell you the truth.
Wow. What was the name of the app again?
It's called Sleep Cycle.
Okay.
There are others that are like it, but that's the one in particular that I use.
Do you know if it's on iOS and And on
I
Android?
believe it's also on Android. It's for both kinds of devices.
We'll put a link in the show notes. And I need to actually add one question to it, so we'll add it this time.
Okay.
So do you actually have any home automation devices in your life right now?
I'm embarrassed to say that I do not.
And
Not a
you've
single.
known me for how long,
Not a single
John?
light bulb. I don't know.
I've got to do a consult with you.
I know. I guess I haven't made up my mind as to whether I need it necessarily. But I'm also. I'm low tech. I mean, I'm also the first to admit that I don't own a TV, and I haven't for years. So maybe that has something to do with it. I'm not sure.
Could be. And you like physical books?
I do. So I mean, maybe I think automation is fantastic, and it's very definitely the way of the future. And we're in this transition period right now where we've gone from having none of it to it's seeping into different aspects of life. And I'm just kind of, I guess, waiting to see how it settles out and what becomes routine, so that I know what to expect if I move into a new place, that sort of thing.
Right.
As opposed to what things are. They kind of have that cool factor, but it wears off in a couple of years.
Sometimes it does. I'll have to get you a smart bulb that doesn't emit blue light
that doesn't
for the
emit
holidays.
blue light, or at least you can control it.
You can control it.
Right.
Well, John, it's been great. It's been a while since I actually get to see you in person, and it's been great to have you as an in studio guest on the interview couch.
Well, thank you for having me.
And a lot of great info. What else do you want to plug? Web addresses? Anything about the IDA, or mention any last thing to the audience?
I guess what I would mention to wrap it up is, again, our issue is a little unfamiliar to a lot of people. We're making progress in it and the awareness of it generally. We think there's something of interest for practically everybody in the issue. And if you want to find out more about the issue or more about our organization, you can visit our website, which is www.darksky.org.
It's easy to remember. John, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Joe.
It's been awesome.
Yeah.
Great information. Thank you so much. That's it for this episode of the Conversation of Things podcast. You can find all of the episodes and many ways to subscribe to the show at conversationofthings.com. And if you have a question or comment on the show, I'd love your feedback at joe@conversationofthings.com. This podcast, along with all of the Smarter Home Life content, is made possible in part by kind, wonderful audience members like you. Learn how you can help support the show at smarterhomelife.com/support. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you on the next Conversation of Things.